Greetings, and thank you for joining today's Crimson Society presentation on Life Through Letters, following friendships from Harvard and beyond. My name is Joyce Putnam Curl, and I am a member of the Radcliffe class of 1965 and a tri-chair of the Crimson Society Planning Committee. Before we begin, I want to review a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's event is being held on Zoom meeting. If you need tech support or have a question, please chat HAA support. Closed captioning is available by pressing the CC button at the bottom right of your Zoom in screen. If you have questions for our presenters during the program, please chat HAA Q&A with your question. They will call on you during the Q&A and ask you to unmute yourself to ask your question. And now I am happy to introduce Dr. Jerome Offord Jr., the new Associate Librarian for Anti-Racism. In this role, Dr. Offord will expand upon the library's strong record of diversity initiatives by means of systemic change through the library's workforce, services, collections, and space. Before joining Harvard, Dr. Offord served as Vice President for Business and Administration at DeEtta Jones Associates. Dr. Offord has held cabinet positions at Lincoln University of Missouri, an historically Black college and university, over a span of 8 years. Please welcome Dr. Offord.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon. I'm excited to be here with you all and to share a little bit about our program and to introduce our speakers. Individual stories from the Harvard community across different time periods provide us with a chance to contextualize student life and experiences and how campus has evolved since. While these stories illustrate how different parts of history were, they more often underscore the same challenges and sentiments that have been faced for centuries. Whether several decades ago, a century back, or even for our current students, the camaraderie and championship that can be formed during the college experience stands the test of time. These stories also illuminate broad themes and conversations that parallel with Harvard Library's own values of diversity, inclusion, and belonging. As a part of the American higher education system and research institution industry, Harvard Library is uniquely positioned to be a leader in advancing open knowledge and increasing access to materials from all voices and perspectives. The success in how broadly our services are accessed relies on how inclusive our physical and digital spaces feel to each scholar and user. We must also confront library-specific issues like technology disparities and unequal access to information, which have disproportionately harmful effects for some groups, depending on factors such as race, ethnicity, economics, technical limitations, and disabilities. The work of becoming an anti-racist library is an opportunity for us to model and live our organizational values, which emphasize that we lead with curiosity, seek collaboration, champion access, aim for extraordinary, and cultivate and celebrate diversity in our collections and our community to construct a more inclusive and just world. These values are significant not only within our libraries, but also across Harvard's campus. The feelings of inclusion and belonging are foundational for forging friendships on university campuses, which we will see in today's discussion. The program this afternoon will be led by Jahan Sinclair and Ross Wilcare, who will share with us a series of letters amongst a group of 3 undergraduates, now alums, from the 1950s. These letters illustrate common undergraduate challenges and excitements and follow the group into their postgraduate life as professionals, continuing the bonds of friendship forged as students despite the growing geographical distances as they move further from Cambridge. It is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers, Jahan Sinclair, who is the anti-Black racism librarian and archivist for Harvard Library. Her work highlights diverse archival collections and resources on anti-racism across the university. And Ross Mulcair is the Associate University Archivist for Community Engagement at Harvard University Archives, where he connects students, researchers, alumni, and administrators to Harvard's long history. He is an alumnus of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, having received his PhD in history in 2016.
Thanks, Jerome. Hi, everyone. As Jerome mentioned, my name is Ross Mulcair, the Associate University Archivist for Community Engagement at the Harvard University Archives. And my colleague Jahan and I are really excited to share with you all some interesting stories drawn from our archival collections at the University Archives. Before we get started, I do want to say thank you to the Harvard Alumni Association for inviting us to this event. Thank you to both Joyce and Jerome for your introductory remarks. And of course, thank you to you all for joining. Some of you may have attended previous alumni events where Jahan, myself, and other colleagues at Harvard Library have presented archival materials and stories, but we're going to do something a little bit different here today. Previously, we've focused on figures from Harvard history that are notable in some way, people who left some mark on Harvard that gives a foundation for really interesting storytelling. The students we built today's program around are frankly no less impressive, but the framing of the story here is more quotidian in nature. We wanted to do two things here. First, we want to give a sense of Harvard in the 1950s, which is a really interesting moment, being situated in the years of post-war prosperity and relative stability, but also being marked by creeping Cold War anxieties, and of course, a new era of the civil rights movement in the US, spurred by the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954. You'll see aspects of all of that in these stories. The second theme we want to explore is one about friendship. So this is the more quotidian theme, I would say. Thinking about how sharing a college experience with classmates can create unique and lasting bonds between young people. As you'll learn about in a moment, we are able to do this because of a generous donation of personal materials, including letters between friends, by several alumni from this period. Those letters give us a nice grounded core around which we can build this narrative about friendship and about 1950s life at Harvard. One of the other differences between our previous programming and today's is that the 1950s, unlike much earlier histories we've worked with, are in living memory. So I know we have alumni at this event right now who lived through this period we're describing, and I'm hoping that in the Q&A section after the presentation, we might get into some insights about how well the story we're telling fits with people's experiences that were there. So Jahan and I are, of course, acting as archivists and historians. We weren't there, so our story will necessarily be incomplete, which does reflect the fact that the documentary evidence we have is incomplete, with major gaps in it and limited perspectives. But hopefully, nevertheless, the presentation and the stories we tell are compelling and evocative of the period. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jahan, who will introduce herself and our cast of characters for the next 25 minutes or so.
Thank you, Ross. And hi, everyone. Let me share my screen with you all. Can everybody see that okay? Great. Okay. Well, I'm Jahan Sinclair, and I'm the Anti-Black Racism Librarian / Archivist for Harvard Library. And today we'll be exploring aspects of 1950s Harvard through the letters of a group of friends who met as freshmen in 1952 and continued their friendship into adulthood. These friends were Joseph Steinberg, Reagan Henry, and Howard Muson, otherwise known as Joe, Ray, and Moose, all members of the class of 1956. This presentation is grounded in 3 personal archival collections that were donated to the Harvard University Archives by Steinberg and Muson between 2017 and 2019. The letters and memorabilia in these collections will serve as touch points to broader events at Harvard and Radcliffe in the 1950s. In addition to the letters, archival collections and historical resources from the Harvard University Archives and the Radcliffe College Archives at Schlesinger Library will help to create snapshots of the 1950s student experience. So without further ado, let's get started. Freshman year, 1952 to 1953. In the 1952-53 school year, Harvard accepted an exceptionally large freshman class. With 102 more students incoming than expected, the houses and dorms were overcrowded. Single rooms became doubles or triples, and overflow housing was needed to accommodate all students. In that year's annual report to the Harvard president, the new dean of freshmen, Francis Skiddy von Stade Jr., wrote, "We had hoped for a class of no more than 1,150, with a maximum of 980 living in the yard dormitories. The fact that we had so few cases of disturbance and friction testifies to the goodwill of the students." Among those good-willed students was Joe Steinberg, a young man from New Jersey who arrived at Harvard in 1952. Joe moved into Thayer Hall, where he met his roommates, Howard Muson, a student from New York State, and Reagan Henry, an African-American student from Ohio. Within the first few months on campus, the trio became fast friends. In these letters from Joe's freshman year, we see him settling into his classes and assignments and socializing with students from Harvard and the greater Boston area. He mentions swimming and playing tennis with his roommates, going out for pizza with acquaintances, and going on a date with a Wellesley student. On this slide, we have a bursar's office card with Joe's dorm address on it, Thayer 64, a photo of Thayer Hall, and one of the letters Joe sent to his family during his freshman year. And if you look at the top of the letter, there's a amusing handwritten note that reads, "Ray washed some of my underwear with his clothes in the laundromat today, and his red socks ran. I now have 4 pairs of beautiful pink shorts." No matter the decade, clothes running in the laundry will always be a problem. The 3 friends would have had the opportunity to attend the Harvard Freshman Smoker. The Smoker was a large party sponsored by Student Council with free drinks, beer, and entertainment. After World War II, the Freshman Smoker was moved to a memorial hall to accommodate larger class sizes. In 1952, freshmen enjoyed live entertainment from big band singer Helen O'Connell. The freshman smokers would be banned in 1956 by the dean of freshmen for their rowdiness and, quote, "unpleasant mob incidents." Over at Radcliffe, students got to know their classmates and neighbors at the freshman orientation dance. In this annual event, Radcliffe students had their pickup dance partners as Harvard men, and some stray MIT students outnumbered Radcliffe women 8-1. Here we have a comic from the Radcliffe News that was used throughout the 1950s when describing the orientation dance, and a photo taken at one of these dances featuring a Radcliffe student at the piano surrounded by Harvard men. I wanted to pause here to discuss a noteworthy event at Harvard that occurred in the spring of 1952. Joe, Reagan, and Howard would have been living in the shadow of this incident when they arrived at Harvard some months later. 1952 was a national election year, and the United States was in the midst of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare. As Harvard was accused of being a hotbed of communist infiltration, student political groups rallied around presidential candidates Dwight D. Eisenhower, Adlai Stevenson, and unexpected newcomer, Pogo Possum. Pogo was a daily newspaper comic about a group of anthropomorphic animals living in the Okefenokee Swamp. Created by Walt Kelly, the comic was known for its political satire, and in 1952, the titular character Pogo made a run for president. Harvard Crimson reporters ran with the gag, endorsing Pogo and distributing I Go Pogo buttons. In May 1952, the Crimson invited Walt Kelly to speak at Harvard on behalf of Pogo. Students organized a political rally in support of Pogo with signs, buttons, and marches. Over 1,500 chanting students gathered in Harvard Square. The density of the crowd blocked traffic. When a handful of students began climbing the electric trolleys and disconnecting them from the power lines, Cambridge police rushed the crowd, beating and arresting students. 28 students were arrested and many others injured. This event, known today as the Pogo Riot, was a flashpoint in the contentious relationship between Harvard students and Cambridge residents. Returning to our group of friends from the class of 1956, the summer after their first year at Harvard, Joe, Reagan, and Howard shared updates on their lives as they returned to their hometowns. Reagan returned to Hamilton, Ohio, where he lamented the lack of things to do in town. In a 1953 letter to Joe, he wrote, "There is absolutely nothing recreational to do in, as you might call it, this hick town. Since being home, I have seen 4 movies. The only reason I haven't seen more is because there are no more. I've seen every picture in town." That summer, Reagan also had difficulties finding a job, but a few weeks later, he wrote to Joe with good news. First, I have a very good job. After looking into every possibility on my own, I was on the verge of resigning from active life. I simply couldn't get a decent job. Perhaps I should add that many of Hamilton's business firms refused to employ Negroes. Then some people with pull took over. Overnight, I had appointments with men who wouldn't let me near their offices the day before. And more, I got a job at the Beckett Paper Company. As an archivist, I'm curious about what overnight event occurred in town or which people with pull took over that enabled Reagan to overcome local discriminatory hiring practices, but it's fortunate that Reagan was able to find a good summer job all the same. Here we have one of the letters Reagan sent to Joe during the summer and a close-up of his signature. Meanwhile, in Mount Vernon, New York, Howard wrote to Joe after taking a day trip to visit him in New Jersey. On the trip, Howard met Joe's family and friends and went on a date with a girl he met while there. He later wrote to Joe, fretting over how the date went. I could not tell whether she had a favorable impression of me or was just being nice. If you can, I'd appreciate it if you'd find out from the grapevine whether she really wants to come out, whether she really wants me to come out and see her again. Please, Joseph, be tactful. I don't like to make such a federal case out of it, but you can see that it's not really worth my while to come so far for a lost cause. Would you mind if I came out again and doubled with you? Worrying over whether or not someone likes you and sending your friend in to get more information is a cross-generational situation that will be familiar to many of us. Here we have one of the letters Howard sent to Joe during the summer. On the envelope, there was a note that read, "Send me, P.S. Joe, send me Ray's address again." Howard also signed his letters with a caricature of himself, which is a fun, personal touch. Sophomore year, 1953-54.
Thanks, Jahan. I can give you a break for a minute while we take a brief administrative detour here. So one of the major events of 1953, at least in Harvard world, was the installation of Nathan Pusey as president of Harvard that October. Pusey took over from James Conant, who had served as president for the previous 2 decades, starting in 1933. We could spend hours comparing and contrasting these two men, both their personalities and presidencies, but I want to offer just 2 quick points of comparison that I think are helpful for thinking about changes that were happening at Harvard more broadly. So one of the differences between these two was their background, where they came from and how they came to Harvard. Conant is a pretty good representative of a prototypical Harvard student, at least in its first 3 centuries. While he wasn't from a Boston Brahmin family like his predecessor, Lawrence Lowell, he was certainly a New Englander, having been born in Dorchester in 1893. And New Englanders, for centuries, made up the largest block of Harvard students, geographically speaking. Conant's path to Harvard was a common one, too. He entered the Roxbury Latin School in 1904, graduating in 1910, and arrived at Harvard that year. Pusey, on the other hand, represents a different kind of Harvard student, one who made his way to Harvard outside of the private day school pipeline. Pusey was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and went to high school at Abraham Lincoln High School, which is part of the Council Bluffs Community School District. I mention these differences in their origins mostly because they're actually representative of changes at Harvard more broadly. Even though Harvard really became a national university under the presidency of Charles Eliot around the turn of the century, it was really during this post-war period, during Pusey's administration, that there was a serious uptick in regional diversity of the student body. Some of this was due to the GI Bill, which happened under Conant, making college more accessible to a more diverse population. But some of this was also due to changes in recruiting policies and admissions at Harvard, which Pusey implemented. Secondly, I'll mention that these two had very different conceptions about the role of a university in society. Conant, partly because of timing, was deeply embedded in the war effort of the United States in World War II, really in a lot of ways putting Harvard on a war footing for the better part of the 1940s. He himself was engaged in research and research support on behalf of the government. Pusey, on the other hand, was more inward looking at Harvard, less apt to commit the university to national endeavors, martial or otherwise. Pusey's own engagement with global politics and war would come later in his presidency during the Vietnam War, most notably when his administration was forced to reckon with the student-led anti-war movement that reached its height in Cambridge in 1969. So I will turn it back over to Jahan to pick up the story for us.
Thank you, Ross. In one of the collections donated by Joe, there is a program for the event Drumbeats and Song with the Harvard Band, which he presumably attended in March 1954 at Radcliffe College. Dating back to 1947, Drumbeats and Song was a popular annual concert and theatrical event organized by students at Radcliffe College to raise money for the Radcliffe Grant and Aid Fund. These grants provided small sums of money to Radcliffe students whose extracurricular activities prevented them from taking outside jobs. Over the years, Drumbeats and Song evolved into an expansive semi-professional production. The 1954 show included an original musical that premiered to rave reviews. The Harvard Crimson reported, "The Harvard Band started off the latest chapter of Drumbeats and Song with a program of marches, medleys, and the best band music in the country. After this predictably excellent hors d'oeuvre came a main course that was a delightful surprise. It is incredible that a show, and an amateur one to boot, could maintain so high a level of music and lyrics as I saw last night, and yet Eiffel Trifle goes from one high point to the next with the most minor of sags." Here we have a photo of the 1954 Drumbeats and Song program and a collage of photos from the show featured in the Radcliffe yearbook that year. The traditional grand finale of the Drumbeats and Song show was the Radcliffe kick line seen in the top corner here. I wanted to take this moment to discuss Radcliffe College more generally in the 1950s. As many of you already know, Radcliffe College was the all-women counterpart to Harvard, established in 1879. Harvard faculty taught classes at Radcliffe, so students there received an equivalent education. During World War II, declining male enrollment at Harvard and a desire for efficiency led to a historic change. In 1943, as Radcliffe President Wilbur Kitchener Jordan took office, a temporary agreement was made between Harvard and Radcliffe for joint instruction. For the first time ever, Radcliffe and Harvard students attended the same classes in Harvard Yard. In 1947, this temporary arrangement for coeducational classes became an established policy called joint instruction. Here we see Radcliffe women and Harvard men together in an English class. But joint instruction wasn't without its challenges. The 1950s was an uneasy transitional period for Radcliffe, where academic classes and increasingly extracurricular activities merged with Harvard. Radcliffe women faced sexism, both casual and overt, from Harvard faculty, students, and administration, who often tolerated their presence instead of actively welcoming them. In 1952, Harvard President James Conant said of the Harvard-Radcliffe relationship, "Harvard is not coeducation in theory, only in practice." In a 1953 Harvard Crimson article, Elliot Perkins, lecturer in history, stated, "The Yard looked better before, with just Harvard men." Lamont Library, which opened in 1949, did not admit women during the 1950s, and in fact, women were not admitted in Lamont Library until 1967. But Radcliffe students held their own academically. Among the Seven Sisters Women's Colleges, Radcliffe students were historically known for their intelligence, and in the 1950s, Harvard men complained that too many Cliffies in a class raised the grading curve. Here we have members of the Radcliffe Idler Club and the Harvard Dramatic Club rehearsing for a performance of Hamlet. And in the 1950s, many Radcliffe students groups began to merge with their Harvard counterparts. While Harvard-based clubs and extracurriculars offered greater resources and prestige, women were overlooked for leadership positions within these organizations until the 1960s and 70s. Still, Radcliffe College offered students a one-of-a-kind college experience. A 1952 article in the women's magazine Mademoiselle wrote of Radcliffe, "Today's Radcliffe women claim a unique combination of advantages. They enjoy the close, friendly life of a small college, less than half the size of Smith, yet they are part of the driving force, the brisk competition of a great university. They go to class with men, but have a campus of their own, an extra Harvard social life. And still, the biggest draw of all, Radcliffe's faculty is the Harvard faculty." Junior year, 1954 to 1955. Political clubs abounded at Harvard in the 1950s. There was the New Conservative Club, the Liberal Union, the Social Democratic Forum, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Society for Minority Rights, the United Nations Council, World Federalists, the Young Republican Club, and the Young Democratic Club. Joe was a longtime member of the Harvard Young Democratic Club. The club hosted discussion forums with Democratic speakers and volunteered in Democratic campaigning efforts. Here we have Joe's Young Democratic Club member card from 1952, his freshman year. As you can see, his involvement continued into grad school as a member of the Harvard Law School Democratic Club in 1959. We also have a club event poster from 1954. In 1955, Joe had an unexpected opportunity to meet Democratic presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson. He wrote about the encounter in a letter to his family. Now for the big news. On Thursday night, I found out that I was going to spend some time with Stevenson Saturday morning before he left for New York. So yesterday morning, about 16 of us in the Young Democrats Club were ushered in to see him, and we spent about 25 minutes talking to him and questioning him. He is smaller than I had imagined, and portlier too. He is extremely charming, smiles broadly, and quips as wittily as he does in his speeches. I asked him 3 or 4 questions myself, which he answered very intelligently. Joe was also a member of Students for Stevenson in 1955, but as history would have it, Dwight D. Eisenhower beat Adlai Stevenson in the US presidential election in 1952 and 1956. Senior year, 1955 to 1956. As you remember from the beginning of the presentation, the class of 1956 was one of the largest freshman classes ever accepted, and overcrowding in the dorms was an issue. The problem continued into subsequent years. Traditionally, rising sophomores applied to their house of choice and, once accepted, lived there for the rest of their undergraduate career. But in 1953, for the first time in the history of the Harvard house system, house masters did not issue rejections. Instead, excess students were admitted as non-resident members, and additional housing, such as Claverley Hall on Mount Auburn Street, was used for overflow. Joe, Reagan, and Howard were 3 such students who were housed in Claverley their sophomore year, but they were eventually resident members of Kirkland House. In 1955, history professor Charles H. Taylor became master of Kirkland House, and the house yard received some much-needed repairs and renovations. Here we have Joe's Kirkland House member card from his senior year and some historic photos of Kirkland House. An ever-popular student activity in the 1950s was attending the Harvard football games. Gathered at Harvard Stadium, Harvard and Radcliffe students cheered on their home team while socializing with friends and dates. Here we have a program from a 1955 Harvard-Princeton game and a ticket from a 1956 Harvard-Yale game. We also have a photo of cheerleaders at a 1954 Harvard football game. During the 1955-56 school year, Reagan Henry was captain of the junior varsity football team. You can see him seated center here, holding a football. The JV team had a hard time that year. Many of the team's best players had been moved up to varsity reserves or the varsity team itself, and Reagan was one of 3 holdovers from the last year's team. The JV football team won only 1 of 5 games that year, losing 3 by shutouts, but Reagan still had a moment of glory during the team's winning match against Dean Academy when he carried the ball 9 yards for a touchdown. As many Harvard students have done in the past and will continue to do in the future, Joe spent much of his senior year working on his undergraduate thesis. In a letter to his aunt, Joe wrote, "The horrible thesis still plods along. Seems like it will never end. It now has increased up to about 130 pages, and I've yet another chapter to write. The damn thing has eaten into my time rather much lately, and I can't report any great excitement here in Boston." Joe successfully completed his honors thesis in government titled Labor in Massachusetts Politics, the Internal Organization of the CIO and AFL for Political Action, 1948 to 1955. And here we have the titles of the honors theses written by Joe, Reagan, and Howard. We also have a photo of one of Joe's typewritten thesis note cards. The trio of friends, who all concentrated in government, had shared the past 4 years of their lives as roommates and classmates. But as senior year came to a close, it was time to celebrate and say farewell to Harvard. Here we have a selection of commencement memorabilia from 1956, including a program, ticket, and schedule. That year, class week events included the senior spread, which was a late night formal dance and midnight supper for seniors and their dates, a moonlight cruise on the SS Seabelle for seniors and their parents and friends, and commissioning ceremonies for the Navy, Army, and Air Force, in which seniors who participated in ROTC were commissioned as officers. Radcliffe College held their commencement activities and events that same week in June. In 1956, 229 Radcliffe College seniors received their bachelor's degrees. Radcliffe also awarded 36 PhDs, which at the time was the largest number ever granted in any one year. After graduation, Joe, Reagan, and Howard took different paths as they ventured into adulthood, but kept in touch via letters. By 1958, Reagan was in the Army, as discussed in this letter on the left. For context, the military draft in the United States lasted through the 1940s and into the 1970s. All young men were required to serve, but could defer for various reasons, including being a student. Reagan wrote to Joe, who was now a third-year grad student at Harvard Law School. Dear Jody, I don't expect you to believe this is being written at 6:30 a.m., but it is. Anything can happen in the Army, especially at Fort Monmouth. I have the day off, but these crude people harassed me out of bed at 5:30. Stationed in New Jersey, Reagan visited New York City on his days off, attending orchestra and opera shows. He also made visits to Joe's family. And Reagan served 2 years in the Army Signal Corps. In 1958, Reagan married Helen Smith and soon had a baby on the way. After getting married, Reagan's letters to Joe are signed by both himself and Helen, as you can see in this letter snippet right here. And as Reagan prepared to attend Harvard Law School in the fall, it was Joe's turn to fulfill his military obligations. Joe was stationed at Fort Gordon in Georgia, and before leaving for the National Guard service in 1959, Reagan wrote to Joe, "Don't let them make you a segregationist during your stay in Georgia. I am very anxious to hear your impressions of the South." Meanwhile, on the West Coast, Howard was a graduate student in government at the University of California, Berkeley. In his letters to Joe and Reagan from 1957 and 58, Howard talks about differences between East Coast and West Coast culture. So there it is. I've gone all American. Everything is big here. The football, the steaks, the people. I am at a disadvantage without a car here. Wish I had that Italian scooter. The people live in cars in California. They eat in them, travel in them, make love in them, study in them. It's unbelievable. The place is so big, you really need a car. Howard regales his friends with humorous stories of Hollywood types and wild parties. Howard also seemed inspired by the beatnik scene. At night, he went to poetry workshops taught by activist group poet Lawrence Hart, and he sent his friends copies of Howl by Beat Generation author Allen Ginsberg. In a letter to Joe pictured here, he wrote, "By the way, did you folks receive Howl? And have you been thereby uplifted? Well, from the talk of investments and that sort of thing, I see that you don't want to become beatniks or bleatniks howling." I wanted to end on this letter from Reagan to Joe dated November 20th, 1959, because I think it really demonstrates how Harvard continued to serve as a significant bonding point between this group of friends. It reads, "Dear Jody, I'm writing this as I listen to the Harvard-Yale game. Though I don't entertain any real hopes that we will win, it would please me greatly if you should read of a Crimson victory before receiving this letter. Between updates on family, friends, law school, and Boston politics, Reagan weaves in details about the Harvard-Yale football game. The baby is doing fine. His weight has doubled and he's gained 3 inches in 10 weeks. Harvard recovered a Yale fumble on the kickoff. This generally doesn't happen until about 5 months. He's a pretty perfect little boy, much to the pleasure of both Helen and I." He ends the letter with the score so far: Harvard 35, Yale 6, and it's not over. So what became of this trio of friends? Diverting from government and political science, Howard Muson went into journalism. He worked for a variety of publications, including the Hartford Courant, Times Magazine, and New York Times Magazine. He was also the executive editor of Psychology Today. Reagan Henry went on to be a lawyer and media executive. He was the first African-American to own a network-affiliated television station, purchasing WHEC in Rochester, New York in 1979. He started his own business, Broadcast Enterprises Network, Inc., which became the largest Black broadcasting group in the United States. By 1990, he owned more than 60 broadcast stations across the US. Reagan passed away in July 2008. Joe Steinberg went on to be a successful attorney, becoming a partner at the law firm Lowenstein Sandler in 1965. In the 2000s, he counseled law students and taught seminar classes at Seton Hall University School of Law in Newark, New Jersey. Joe remained an active Harvard alumnus, serving as president of the Harvard Club of New Jersey and serving on the club scholarship committee. We're thankful for Joe's and Howard's archival donation, which made today's presentation possible. So I did a lot of research on this presentation, but nothing beats hearing from someone who was actually there. So please welcome member of the class of 1956, Joseph Steinberg, who will be sharing a few words with us.
I have to hit those unmute buttons first. Okay, first of all, I want to say that I've learned a lot about my years at Harvard from your presentation. Thank you very much. Now I'm holding up a book that I want everybody to go out and buy if you haven't already. It's called The Last Negroes at Harvard. And the subtitle is The Class of 1963 and the 18 Young Men Who Changed Harvard Forever. It's written by a man named Kent Garrett and also by someone named James Ellsworth. It's a very important book, I think, and it was particularly interesting to me because of some of the things that the author talks about in the book. For one thing, he says that there was a box that was on the application to Harvard that you had to check. You could check if you wanted to. And the box read, check here if you wouldn't mind rooming with somebody not of your race. Now, I found that interesting because there was no such box 8 years earlier when I applied to Harvard. But I want to tell you, and this is the truth, I received a letter in the mail from the Harvard admissions office saying, and I have not kept that letter. It's unfortunate that I haven't. But to my recollection, the letter said, you have tentatively been assigned to a room with 2 roommates. They told me who the 2 roommates were. One of them by his name, and by his very name, was clearly Irish. I found out later his father was the governor of the state of Rhode Island. But the letter went on, one of the 2 potential roommates of yours is a Negro. I want to say now that my mother had a fit. She was born in Iowa, lived for a short time in upper New York State, but basically went to school until her senior year in high school in Waynesboro, Virginia, not terribly far from the Tennessee and North Carolina borders, and the southern end of the Skyline, the Skyline Drive. And my mother was very unhappy and said to me, think about what your social life will be like at school. Well, if she had only known, my social life would have been horrendous had I not roomed with Reagan Henry. And although I hate to do this, I want to say that, Jahan, you made one mistake in your presentation. Howard Muson did not room with us in our freshman year. I was a member of the dorm crew. Now, for those of you who don't know what the dorm crew was, it was a group of people who were paid, believe it or not, $1.25 per bathroom to clean it up. That's after we spent some time in the late summer and early fall getting the rooms ready for people who had been admitted to Harvard in the yard. Well, I cleaned Howard Muson's bathroom, and that's how I became friendly with him and asked him to join us in our sophomore year at, yes, Claverley Hall. There's a story there too. Claverley Hall was the place where Franklin Delano Roosevelt roomed when he was at Harvard. He had a wonderful room there, and the rooms were very, very nice, as I recall. Incidentally, one of my daughters who went to Harvard College was married across the street from Claverley Hall many years later. And she's now a proud graduate of the college, having graduated in 2001. Now, Reagan Henry came from Hamilton, Ohio. That's where he went to Hamilton High School. It's very interesting to think back to what Harvard was like in the day, that is in 1952. There were no women on campus at all. That is to say, we did go to class with Radcliffe women, but there was such a thing as parietal rules. And for those of you who don't know what those are, there was a very, very short period of time during the course of a week. I think it was Saturday nights and Sunday afternoons when you could have a date, and 90% of us dated at Radcliffe, which meant that since almost nobody had a car, it was unheard of, really, for a freshman to have a car, and even for that matter, for upper class men to have a car. You had to walk about 6 or 7 blocks to get up to Radcliffe to have a date. And you could not have women in your room except on those few hours every week. The parietal rules were very strongly enforced, and it is true, as Ms. St. Clair said earlier, that in the undergraduate library, there was absolutely forbidden for any women to be in that structure. They were permitted in the big library at Harvard, but nobody went there. I mean, it was impossible to study there, and if you went into the stacks, you couldn't find your way out for weeks. So nobody ever went there. It is indeed interesting that Jahan found these letters interesting. I didn't. I read a few of them that she was so kind as to reproduce and send to me. The letters home were basically, I'm sending a bill, please pay it. But by the way, the tuition was $600 a year, not an hour. $600 a year, $300 a semester. The letters that I read to and from Howard and Reagan and from me were all about 2 things, mainly drinking and women. Those are the 2 things that kept us very much occupied The Harvard campus was a campus that was not what you would find today. I went back and looked at my freshman register, which I'm holding up here, so you all can see it. Just looking at
I thought the letters were interesting, and I do hope the people here today also found them interesting from the presentation.
I think that probably people would find them interesting if you were focused on what Harvard was like in the 1950s. Yes. By the way, one of the sad things.
Joe, sure. One more thing, but I wanted to make sure we had time for a brief Q&A with the audience.
Yes, I'm going to wind it up right here by saying that one of the great things about Harvard, as I look back on my years there, was my roommates, both Howard and Reagan. And it's unfortunate that Reagan passed away at a relatively young age. By the way, he was worth $40 million when he passed. He did very, very well for himself. And Howard Musan and I are still friends to this very day. As a matter of fact, I invited him to join me today. And he said, I can't make it today, but, and then this was the but that was very important. He said, I was a callow young man. Don't embarrass me too much. Howard, if this is recorded and you see the recording, I didn't embarrass you at all. Jahan did.
Thank you so much, Joe.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you, Jahan. Really, thank you, Joe, for kind of giving the personal insight into this story that Jahan was able to mine from the archives. I do know we have about 10 minutes left, which is great. I think we have some questions that have started to flow in about the presentation and related topics, and we have some that were submitted ahead of time too. So I want to go ahead and start with a question from Pearl Chan. Pearl, if you want to unmute, you are welcome to just ask your question and we will attempt to answer it.
Thanks. This was delightful. I'm so glad that I was able to join, and I learned so much that I didn't know before. I had sort of a little set of questions. I was wondering how materials come to you as the archivist, and how do you decide what to accept and what to decline? And also, do you actively preserve artifacts of the present day, or do you sort of wait to let things ripen and sort themselves out? And then kind of the bonus question is, how do you get a job as a Harvard archivist?
Sure, so I can start to answer that, and Jahan, I can turn it over to you to answer kind of the back end of that. But the first bit of that question about how do things come to the archives, that's a complicated answer, and I'm going to give a not very complicated, or it's a complicated question that I'm going to give a not super complicated answer to. But basically, at a university archives, we are responsible for documenting Harvard University and all its complexity. Some of those records come in on a general record schedule, so they would come in from offices that are kind of documenting what's happening at Harvard, as you might expect. But other things come in through personal donations. So, for instance, Joe, who gave letters and other Harvard material, came to the archives, and other people, faculty, when they retire, often will give personal collections that come in that way. So that's one way that things come in. I'm referring back to your question because the second part of it was, how do we decide what to accept and what to decline? That's going to vary based on the repository. And there's actually a team of people at the university archives. The team does not include either Jahan or myself, but there are people that do a process called appraisal, which is exactly what it sounds like, to sort of appraise collections for their historical value. And that's an interesting process that has a lot of theory behind it and a lot of craft behind it as well. So people are kind of making active decisions about what will have long-term historical and archival value. Not everyone agrees on that, of course. As far as actively preserving artifacts of the present day, of course, we bring in material, those records I mentioned, but then we also bring in digital objects, because a lot of things happen digitally, of course. So capturing websites and social media, student publications, the Crimson, anything sort of published on paper or online, we're going to be collecting as well. So, not necessarily letting things ripen, as you phrase it. I think things come in, and then as interests change over time, what is compelling to people, it's hard to tell always now, but that does ripen in some ways over time, and often in unexpected ways. And I can let Jahan answer a little bit about how you become an archivist, because my path to working at the archives was sort of circuitous and not the normal path, whereas Jahan's is a little more how a person would make their way to be an archivist.
Yeah, I made my way to archives by way of museums. So my background is in anthropology, and I was interested in working in museums and exploring, graduate opportunities in museum studies, but found library and information science is another way to get at history and objects and preserving culture. So having a master's in library and information studies and a concentration in archives is the best way to become an archivist.
Thank you.
So there were a few questions that came in that are all kind of along the same lines. And in fact, some of them came in ahead of time about donating materials to the archives, which is along the same lines, but people were giving some specific examples of kind of Harvard material they had that they might consider giving to the university archives, or Radcliffe College materials. And I wanted to basically put some links in the chat. I wanted to toss it over to Jahan to specifically talk about the Radcliffe College archives and sort of the difference between the holdings at Schlesinger Library versus the university archives. And while she's doing that, I can put in some links for those who might have material that you're interested in contributing to the university archives or to the Radcliffe College archives. These are kind of the places you would go to learn about how to do that. So Jahan, can you tell us a little bit about the university archives versus the Radcliffe College archives?
Sure. Well, for this presentation, of course, I wanted to talk about Radcliffe College as well as Harvard. But as you know, prior to, in the 1950s, there were two separate institutions. And I am an archivist at the Harvard University Archives, where we have the Harvard Archives. That does not include the Radcliffe College Archives. The Radcliffe College Archives are at Schlesinger Library at the Radcliffe Institute. So finding information about the Radcliffe College Archives required me to collaborate with the librarians over at Schlesinger. And thankfully, a lot of the Radcliffe College archives are digitized and online. So if anybody here is interested in looking at, there's beautiful photographs from the 1950s and 60s and 70s that they have digitized online, including all the yearbooks, all the newsletters. A lot of student publications are available online through Schlesinger. And at the Harvard University Archives, of course, we have these huge, massive collections from the 1600s onward, including the 1950s, but pulling out materials related to Radcliffe College in the Harvard University Archives is difficult prior to 1970s and 80s.
Thanks, Jahan. I have a question that was submitted as part of the registration process, so this came to us ahead of time. This is from Anne Harvey, who's class of 1969, who is on this call. Anne, you're welcome to chime in if you want, but I can read the question, which is, are undergraduate theses archived? And if so, how can one obtain a photocopy of a particular thesis? And the answer there is also complicated. Generally, yes. Undergraduate theses are archived. We are the repository of record for undergraduate theses. That being said, not all of them make their way to the university archives, and that's certainly the case historically. We don't have every single undergraduate thesis, and there's all kinds of kind of bureaucratic reasons for why that hasn't happened. What we certainly do get are prize-winning undergraduate papers, so the Hoops Prize, Bowdoin Prizes, and so on. Presumably many or some of you on this call have won those prizes. Your undergraduate theses would be housed at the archives. As far as getting a copy of those, I have another link for you, which I will put in the chat now. This is a little bit about our collection of undergraduate theses, dissertations, and prize papers, and there are some links there that will take you to Hollis, the Harvard Library catalog, where you can search for particular theses. So if you're interested in finding your own or from people you know, family members, you could see if we have them. They would be cataloged in Hollis, and you can request them from there for photo duplication. Generally, it would be digitized and sent to you. So that's definitely an option. I have another question that is from Peter Black, who's the class of 1966. I'm not sure if Peter's on the call, but it's a really important question that I kind of gestured at during the presentation, which was, it's very succinct, which is nice, which is how important was the GI Bill in admissions? And the GI Bill was tremendously important for admissions in the late 1940s and 1950s. So I had mentioned that really caused a kind of diversity of, at least geographical diversity in the Harvard student body. I was looking up a few statistics, and this is kind of interesting about the numbers here, which will give you a sense of what the GI Bill did just quantitatively at Harvard. So 1944, there were 671 men registered at Harvard as students. 671 is not very many. There's an obvious reason there that it's sort of at the peak of World War II, particularly US involvement in World War II, it's a very small number. 1947, 5,353 Harvard students. That's not an incoming class, that's the amount of students at Harvard. That is typically pre-war, you would have had about 3,500 students across the classes at Harvard. So that's not a doubling, but that's a significant increase in the amount of students. And as I mentioned, it's hard to parse out exactly, at least with the records we have, how many of those students are coming on the GI Bill, but we know many of them used GI Bill funds to make Harvard accessible to them, basically. And it was really important in the history of higher education and the history of Harvard for democratizing access to Harvard in many ways. And that democratization economically, of course, has sort of racial and ethnic angles to it. So Harvard became more diverse in all senses because of the GI Bill. It's really a pretty interesting story. I see that Pearl has another question, and we do have time. So please, Pearl, go ahead and unmute and ask away.
As you were talking, I was just thinking, do the archives preserve material culture of Harvard and Radcliffe? I realize that could get very unwieldy very fast, but those kinds of artifacts can also be really interesting.
Yeah, Jahan, do you want to go ahead and talk a little bit about that from the collections that you're familiar with?
Sure. I know that Harvard does preserve material culture, of course, where it's mostly paper, but we do have things like, I see a megaphone when I go down into the second floor of the archives. We have oars from the rowing team. There's t-shirts and posters and flags, pennants, that type of thing. So we do preserve material culture. And I know Schlesinger Library, where I used to work, does as well, including Radcliffe College uniforms, gym uniforms, that type of thing. Are there any other materials that I'm missing, Ross?
No, and I'll say that we don't necessarily have a super active collecting for this. These are things that kind of make their way in, but they are very exciting because we do have in Pusey Library, speaking of Nathan Pusey, Pusey Library is where the archives is housed. And we have one of the few spaces on campus that the public can come into. And we have pretty great exhibit space there. And of course, we really welcome these material items or these objects because they really help tell stories in an exhibit space to this sort of global public that finds their way to us. So thanks, Pearl, for the question.
Great, thanks.
Yep, I want to turn it back over. We need to wrap up now. First of all, I again want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to turn it back over to Joyce to give us some closing thoughts. Oh, Joyce, you're muted.
I want to start with what a wonderful, fascinating program. I want to thank Dr. Jerome Offord, Jahan Sinclair, Ross Mulcair, and Grace Strong, all from the Harvard Library, and the HAA for putting together such a delightful program and event. And a big thank you to Joe Steinberg, for donating his letters and for speaking today. It was very inspiring. We hope that all of you enjoyed today's program and will tune in for some of the upcoming virtual programs that are planned for reunion classes and for members of the Crimson Society. There will be links in the chat, and I want to thank you all again.